Hey there, my name is Nate Bagley, and I am a marriage researcher and an educator. And I have a weekly podcast called Growth Marriage over at growthmarriage.com, where I share my favorite tools and principles and takeaways to help you create a ridiculously awesome, fulfilling, dynamic, passionate marriage. That is my MO. My life's mission is to rid the world of mediocre love, and it has been for nearly a decade. Um, I've been in the marriage business for a while, and it's something that nothing is more fulfilling to me than watching a couple kind of unlock their potential, go from a marriage that they're not entirely satisfied with or that they know they could have more, and then like unlocking that potential and growing together and having their marriage become better than they ever thought it could be. It's possible. I see it happen every day, and it's so rewarding. And over the last decade of doing this work, I don't think a week has gone by that I haven't had somebody reach out to me, whether a husband or a wife, and say, Nate, we need help. Pornography is a problem in our marriage. Whether they are looking at pornography themselves or their partner is looking at pornography, it's causing them heartache. It's causing them to have arguments and disagreements. It's stressful. There's feelings of betrayal and confusion. And man, it's just heartbreaking to hear these stories on such a regular basis. And so this topic has become kind of a passion topic of mine because so many couples reach out to me about it. I have spent years and years reading and studying and going to trainings to learn more about pornography, why it's a problem for couples, and more specifically, how couples can deal with the pornography problem in a way that doesn't end up destroying their marriage. Because all too often, and this is like the sad truth, I think the way that couples try to deal with pornography doesn't get them the results that they want. They deal with the pornography, they get the pornography maybe to stop, but it's at the expense of their marriage. There's still this. Anyway, we'll get into those details a little bit more. Ultimately, what the purpose of this presentation is to give you some tools and some conversations that you can start to have with your partner to help you start down this path of recreating trust, recreating intimacy and connection and playfulness and flirtation again in your marriage. And my hope is that if you are dealing with pornography or if your partner is dealing with pornography, that this will kind of be the light at the end of the tunnel. It will inspire you to move forward in a new and different way, and that it will not only help you deal with the porn problem in a way that feels good to you, but also will help restore your marriage and make it better than it's ever been before. So, with that context in mind, I want to start by telling you a story. Now, this is a fictional story, but it's also not a fictional story. I hope that you find it familiar. It's a story about Michael and Jane. Michael secretly watches pornography. He's been doing it off and on for a while. Oftentimes, it's when he's feeling lonely or stressed or overwhelmed or depressed or anxious. That's when he turns to the pornography. And in every other aspect of his life, Michael sees himself as a really great guy. He's a hard worker at the office. He tries to be an attentive husband and father. He coaches his kids' soccer teams. He goes to church on a regular basis. He does everything within his power to be a really good human and a good father, a good husband. But underneath all of that, he has this secret, and he hates himself for it because this porn secret goes against his values. And so it doesn't sit well with him. And he knows that if anybody found out, especially his wife, that it would be devastating. The porn kind of feels like it's out of control, feels like he can't stop looking at it, even if he wants to, even when he commits himself and says, I'm never going to look again, he kind of ends up, sometimes days, weeks, or months later, going back to the porn. And he doesn't know why. And he's terrified that if his wife finds out, that she's going to think that he's some kind of monster and that she'll divorce him, and then he'll lose everything that he holds dear. Now, eventually, Jane, his wife, finds out about his secret. Regardless of whether Michael confessed to her or she found out on her own, she feels deeply hurt. She feels betrayed. She has tons of unanswered questions for Michael. She has questions like, why did you keep this a secret from me? Or what else are you hiding? If you're hiding this from me, do I even know you? Am I not attractive or sexy enough for you that now you have to go turn to these other women on the internet? Do you care more about porn than you care about our marriage? Like, you had to know that this would put our marriage in jeopardy. So do you care more about that than us? How long has this been going on? Is this going to escalate to the point, like, is it going to get worse and worse and more severe to the point where you're a threat to me or to the children? Are you going to become like Ted Bundy? They are terrified, both of them. And they're both hurt and they're both confused. And so they both decide that they want to start looking for a solution. Now, does this story sound familiar yet? I hope it does, because this is the story of hundreds and hundreds of couples that I've spoken to. It's so common. It writes itself. Now, the immediate question for most people in Michael and Jane's situation is, how do we make this behavior stop? How do we get rid of the porn? They reach out to therapists or religious leaders, or maybe even friends and family if they're feeling courageous, or if they know other people in their life have dealt with this before. They start doing research online. They ultimately want answers. They want help, support, direction, anything. Some people join Facebook groups. Other people go to a treatment program so they can be treated for a porn addiction. Some people just try to figure it out on their own. They don't want anybody finding out what is now their shameful shared secret. These are pretty much the only solutions that most couples are offered. But too often, the solutions provide the opposite of the results that the couples want, like I said earlier. And this kills their intimacy in the relationship over the long term. And it leaves couples feeling stressed and distant from each other and angry and resentful. Now, I want to describe what that looks like. In the case of Michael and Jane, this is kind of how it goes. Jane turns into Michael's monitor. She doesn't want to get hurt again, and she wants to get rid of the porn. And she doesn't want to lose her marriage. So she makes it her responsibility to monitor her husband's internet and phone use. She asks for his passwords. They have regular check-ins to see how he's doing. She takes him to therapy or a 12-step program. She asks him to meet with a religious leader on a regular basis. And she joins Facebook groups where she starts connecting with other women who have felt betrayed by their husband's porn use, even though the posts that often come up in that group kind of feel icky and sad to her. She does all of this to ensure that her husband will never, ever have another slip up, while secretly hating the fact that a slip up is probably inevitable down the road, at which point she's going to have to deal with the feelings of betrayal and broken trust all over again. And then she'll have to confront the question of whether or not this is all even worth it. Oh, so heavy. Like, I'm anxious even just sharing that side of the story. So while all of this is happening with Jane, Michael is going through his own set of miserable experiences that are just no fun. As friends and family start to hear about his porn problem, people start kind of talking behind his back, and he gets labeled, whether he hears it or not, he can definitely feel it. He's kind of getting labeled as a selfish person, as somebody who's immature, or as a sexual deviant who has no kind of self-control. He's treated as if he has no moral compass. He's constantly fed the message that he's undeserving of trust, that he's dirty, that he's unworthy, that he's a disappointment as a husband and a father, and that he's always eventually probably going to end up hurting the people that he loves the most. He walks around in constant fear that one weak moment could result in him losing everything that he holds dear. He's lonely, he feels misunderstood, and he feels like nobody sees any of the good in him anymore. All they see is a man with a porn problem. And nobody hates himself more than he hates himself. And that's saying something, because he hates himself a lot. And this is the tension that Jane and Michael live in day to day for months, years, or even decades. The porn problem might be gone, but the tension and the anxiety is always there in the background, looming, hovering over them. This is like an honest question, but I don't know how a husband and wife could restore trust and intimacy and safety in their relationship if they're constantly holding their breath on high alert, hoping that they're finally done with the porn. Just kind of waiting for the next relapse, wondering if it will mean the end of their marriage. Man, nobody wants to spend the rest of their life or their marriage in this state of just worry and anxiety. So today I want to talk to you about a better way, a way that's going to create space for intimacy and trust to be rebuilt while still allowing for accountability and shared values to be explored. Today, I'm going to share with you a new way of thinking about pornography, and I'm going to share 6 conversations that you can have with your partner that should help you successfully move past your porn problem and help to heal your marriage. Now, I want to start by asking you a question. I legitimately want you to think of the answer here. If I were to ask you, how do you cultivate physical health? How do you cultivate physical health? What would your answer be? Now, most people say things like, oh, Nate, that's obvious. You got to eat healthy. You got to exercise regularly. You got to get 8 hours of sleep. You got to drink lots of water. Now, your physical health is something that you've grown up learning and talking about. For example, your parents probably taught you that you couldn't eat all your Halloween candy in one sitting or you'd end up getting sick. They probably tried to make you eat your vegetables, even the lima beans. They probably had a bedtime routine for you to help you get enough sleep so that you could grow big and strong. From the time you were a kid, you learned the basics of what you needed to do to be physically healthy. You talked about it often, all the time, in school, at home, and just about in every aspect of your life. You talked about health and you kind of, that was present at the top of your mind. That's why there are answers in your head that come along when somebody asks you, hey, how do you be more physically healthy? Like, we all have kind of answers that pop into our head because we've had these conversations. Now, I want to change the context of this question a little bit. I'm going to ask you the same question, but a little bit differently. I want to see if you have a similar answer. So, if I were to ask you, how do you cultivate sexual health? What would your answer be? How do you cultivate sexual health? Not physical health, sexual health. Now, if you're like most people, at first you draw a complete blank. And then you think of a lot of painful and shameful things that you don't want to have as a part of your sexual life. If you're watching this presentation, you're probably thinking about pornography. I don't want porn or masturbation to be a part of my life. Or you want your partner to stop looking at porn or masturbating. Beyond thinking of things that you don't want to be as a part of your sexual life, most people kind of draw a blank. Here's why this is a problem. I have never asked somebody how to become physically healthy and then just had them answer, well, just don't get sick and don't get hurt. Because health is so much more than avoiding sickness and injury. Health is so much more than avoiding sickness and injury. Yet avoiding sickness and injury is typically all that we know about sexual health. So it becomes our go-to strategy. It doesn't work. So that means when couples simply focus on ending the porn use in their marriage, they find that when the porn stops, they face this really disappointing reality that their marriage issues and sex problems don't magically disappear along with the porn. They continue to struggle with trust. They continue to feel misunderstood. They continue to feel anxiety and betrayal. And that's because moving away from sickness or injury is not the same as moving towards health. I'm going to say that again. Moving away from sickness or injury is not the same as moving towards health. Most of us have spent so much time thinking about all the things that can sexually hurt us that we never really stop to think about what positive habits and values that we want to cultivate in our sexual lives. We don't talk about what the eating healthy, the 8 hours of sleep, and the regular exercise of sexual health looks like for us. The conversations around sexual health in our homes are a lot like somebody telling us, don't get diabetes and stay away from cancer and you'll have a long, healthy life or a long, healthy marriage. And until you can talk about sexual health with the same confidence and frequency that you can talk about physical health or even mental health or emotional health or spiritual health, you're never going to be able to take your relationship to a better place. In an ideal world, we would be talking about sexual health in appropriate ways from the time that we were children. But here's the sad truth, and this is something that I learned from a good friend of mine, Doug Braun-Harvey. He says, in order to gain access to a sexual health conversation, most of us have to be a sex addict, a sexual offender, or a victim of sexual abuse. That is the price of entry. Or to put it differently, most people don't really care about sexual health or get to have a conversation about sexual health, especially men, until they've either hurt somebody or been hurt themselves. Isn't that depressing? No wonder we have so much anxiety and shame around talking about sex. It's my belief that when we start creating clarity around what sexual health looks like for us as individuals and as couples, that the sexual problems and injuries and struggles that we face will start to heal and we can move forward in our relationships. So today I'm going to give you 6 conversations that you can have in an ongoing basis with yourself and with your partner to help you move towards trust, towards intimacy and mutual understanding and joy and peace and wholeness and pleasure again. These 6 conversations are not meant to solve all your problems. I want to say that again. These conversations that I'm going to share with you are not meant to solve all of your problems. It's not like a magic bullet. It's not a secret recipe or a shortcut. But the goal of these conversations is to help you start clarifying your sexual values and put together a vision or a plan for what sexual health could look like for you. These conversations are going to challenge you. They're not easy to have all the time. But if you follow through and you have these conversations, they're going to help you develop more empathy and understanding for each other. They're going to help you start to rebuild trust and intimacy. And they can shine a light on the path that you need to take to develop a thriving, sexually healthy relationship with each other that is full of trust and joy and flirtation and connection and passion and so much more. All the things that you want to be part of your marriage. Are you ready? I hope you're ready because these conversations are really powerful. These conversations are also based on the World Health Organization's 6 principles of sexual health. And they are consent, non-exploitation, protection from STIs and unintended pregnancy, shared values, honesty, and mutual pleasure. Now I'm going to go over those one by one. So if you're taking notes right now, you don't need to pause or go back. We'll go through these one at a time, and hopefully you can take notes as we go. Now, Doug Braun-Harvey is a guy I quoted earlier, and he's the one who introduced me to these concepts and these principles. And he is an incredible author and an amazing therapist with over 30 years of experience helping people go through the process that I'm going to share with you, where they kind of develop and wrestle and explore sexual health principles in the hope of moving more towards health and instead of just moving away from sickness and injury. And much of what I share with you is informed by his observations and his experiences. So a big shout out to him for all that he has done in this space, and I hope that you find this helpful. So let's start out with talking about consent. So sexual health always consists of a balance of safety and pleasure. Every great sexual relationship has those 2 things, safety and pleasure. Now, consent is the first principle that we are going to talk about today that helps us create safety in a sexual relationship. Consent essentially means voluntary cooperation. Each person in the relationship has the freedom to experience pleasure and intimacy, as well as the freedom to say no to any sort of sexual contact or advances. Some people think that consent is like a permission slip, that your partner isn't allowed to act on any sort of sexual urges or thoughts without checking in with you first, and that is not consent. Not keeping an agreement in your relationship is not the same as violating your physical body. I'm going to say that one more time. Not keeping an agreement in your relationship is not the same as violating your physical body. And consent strictly deals with your freedom to say yes or no at any time and for any reason to somebody else who wants to touch your body or be sexual with you. Some questions that you could ask each other to start having a conversation around consent could be, do either one of us have a history with non-consensual sex? Have any of our friends or family members experienced non-consensual sex? And if so, what was the story and what impact did that have on us? What are we allowed to say no to in any, are we allowed to say no to any sexual activity without fear of punishment? You know, if your partner says no, do you pout? Do you punish them? Do you guilt trip them? These are things that you should explore in the relationship. There are subtle ways that you can manipulate your partner. Have we been punished in the past for saying no to any sort of sexual advance or invitation? These are all questions that you can start to explore as you explore the principle of consent. Now, we'll talk about the next principle. The next one is non-exploitation. Now, exploitation is when you leverage your power or your control over somebody else to get sex. In extreme forms, this could look like violence or threats of violence. There's a lot of domestic abuse in the world, where typically husbands are threaten or hurt their wives in order to get sex from them. That is, that is exploitation at its worst. But violence doesn't always, or threats of violence doesn't always have to be at the root of exploitation. There are a lot of other examples of exploitation. Here's just a couple that I thought of in preparing this presentation. One could be a boss threatening somebody's job or offering them a promotion in exchange for sex or sexual favors. That's probably one that a lot of us have heard about or are familiar with. Using the threat of divorce or the severing of a relationship to get sex or manipulate your partner into behaving in a certain way. And by the way, exploitation doesn't always have to do with sex, but in the context of this presentation, that's kind of how we're talking about it. Another example could be breaking a relationship agreement or having sexual secrets and intentionally hiding that information from your partner. Basically, it's anytime you resort to power or coercion or fear to get what you want. That is exploitation. When we're talking to kids, we often refer to exploitation as bullying. That's another good way to think about it. Exploitative sexual behavior can be consensual, but that doesn't mean that it's virtuous. An example of this is Louis C.K. If you remember him, he was a comedian a couple of years ago that got called out during the Me Too movement for masturbating in front of his female comedian colleagues. And he argued that since they had given consent, like he asked permission and they said yes, that it was okay. But what the women argued in the Me Too movement was that there was a power imbalance, and that at the time he was one of the top comedians in the world, and there's like this major imbalance in the dynamic of the power with his request. And just because they gave consent didn't make it healthy or enjoyable for any of them, and it didn't bring out the best in either party. So that's an example of what consensual and exploitative behavior could look like. Some common ways that couples use exploitation in the context of porn, with this conversation specifically, are maybe the person watching porn hides it from their partner. That's exploitative behavior. That's exploitation. The person watching porn dismisses their partner's negative feelings about the behavior, telling them things like, "You're overreacting," or "It's not that big of a deal." The partner of the person watching porn might make threats to intimidate or manipulate them into behaving a certain way, to stopping looking at porn. And like, anyway, that's another example. That doesn't mean you don't have, I guess this conversation about exploitation doesn't mean that you can't have conversations or set boundaries, but there are better and healthier ways to get the outcomes that you desire and talk about the issue than resorting to exploitation or manipulation to get the results that you want. Some questions and examples of conversations or questions that you could ask each other to start having a conversation about the principle of non-exploitation in your relationship, or whether exploitation has been a part of your relationship, could be, let's see, what's been your experience with being exploited in your life? Man, you can have like a 3-hour conversation about exploitation and ways that you've been exploited in your past with your partner. Another good question is, in what ways have we exploited each other without even realizing it? Man, the more you study exploitation, the more you realize sometimes it's just baked into our culture and our behavior. And there's ways that we have exploited each other and been exploited by each other without even really realizing that we were doing it. How can we appropriately call each other out when we are resorting to exploitation to get what we want in all areas of our lives, including sexually? So these are some good questions that you can start asking to start having a conversation about exploitation and examining how you might use exploitation to get your partner to do what you want, how you might be exploited by your partner or other people in your life. It's a really powerful and life-changing principle when you start introducing this dialogue and these conversations into your life. The next principle we're going to talk about is protection from STIs and unintended pregnancy. Now, this sexual health principle is typically what most of us are taught sexual health is. We're just taught it's this one principle. When we're young, and you go through like the maturation program, or you go through like sex ed in high school, you're taught to practice abstinence or safe sex so you don't get a sexual disease or an unintended pregnancy. We don't need to go too deep into this one, to be honest with you, because we're all pretty much on the same page here, but some good questions to think about if you do want to have a conversation about this, or maybe questions that or kind of ways that you haven't talked about this specific principle in the past. You could ask the question, you could kind of explore the conversations that you've had about contraception in the past. Are you both on the same page with the methods of contraception that you're using? Does your contraception plan work for both of you? You know, some people, their contraception plan is we're going to have sex, and if we have a baby, we have a baby. Like as long as you're both on the same page and the contraception plan that you're using works for both of you, that's great. Okay, now we're going to move on to one of my favorite principles. It's called shared values. Now, shared values is by far one of the most important and subjective sexual health principles. It's all about determining what sex means to you and why. The danger in talking about sexual values is that it's tempting to become defensive when you don't agree on a particular value, especially with your partner. Your way becomes the right way, the good way, the moral way, and your partner's way becomes the wrong way, the bad way, or the immoral way. The goal in having a conversation about your sexual values, especially when they're in conflict with your partner's sexual values, is to seek understanding. The goal is always to seek understanding. Why is this value important to you? And how did it become so important to you? What are the stories behind your values about why you believe this and why this is so important to you? Where did you learn your sexual values? Another great topic of conversation that could provide opportunities for you to explore each other's thoughts and feelings and beliefs around sexual values is to have a conversation about what Doug Braun-Harvey calls your sexual debut, or the moment that you lost your virginity. How was your sexual debut? What did you worry about? What was it like when you did it? Was it a good experience? Was it a nerve-wracking experience? Was it a negative experience? What has been the consequence of how you thought about yourself because of how that moment went? Have you guilted yourself? Have you shamed yourself? Have you felt, I don't know, there's like so much emotion and history that can get wrapped around just that one moment. You could talk about the sexual values of the family that you were raised in. You know, what did your family teach you about sex? Did you feel comfortable talking about it in your home, or was there shame around it? Do you still have shame talking about sex? If so, that's okay, but let's acknowledge it. Were you able to talk about pleasure or desire in your family growing up? Were some things considered good or evil? And if so, what were they? And what do you think of those things now? Has your opinion changed? Has it pretty much stayed the same? Do you know why it stayed the same? Do you want to teach our kids, if we have them, the same things that you were taught about sex growing up? And if not, what would you change? What would you want to teach differently? Oftentimes, when you share the same religion, you make this assumption that your sexual values are the same. And rarely is this ever true. The opportunities to talk about sexual values are literally endless. And the more you talk, the more you can process past pain and past trauma and heartache from the past and reach mutual understanding and create more empathy and connection and move more towards sexual health. The next principle we're going to talk about is honesty. Honesty is all about creating an atmosphere where direct, open, and honest communication with your partner is possible. Honesty entails both appropriately telling the truth and not withholding important information from your partner. Some people think like, oh, withholding information isn't being dishonest, but it absolutely is. It's more than just telling the truth. It's also not withholding important information from your partner. Now, honesty does not mean that you should be given a blank check to be 100% transparent with your thoughts and your feelings and desires, or candidly share whatever you're thinking or feeling without a filter with your partner. That's just being reckless with your thoughts and emotions. So in order for honesty to be present, In any relationship, both partners need to be able to contribute to an environment where the practice of honesty is a safe one. If honesty is met with emotional outbursts, with outrage, with name calling, with complete withdrawal from your partner, with accusations, threats of severing the relationship, or any other emotionally charged behavior, it makes it impossible for honesty to continue in the relationship. So if you react poorly to your partner being honest with you, you are harming the ability for honesty to exist in your relationship. So honesty requires you to share openly and to be transparent with your partner, but it also requires you to make it safe for them to do the same. Similarly, if honesty is delivered with contempt or vitriol or an absence of tact or spite or with arrogance, it's not going to be received well, and it's going to harm the relationship as well. So how you deliver your message is really important to think about as well. Honesty is not about beating your partner over the head with the unfiltered truth. Like, if you had a sexual dream about your husband's brother, he doesn't necessarily need to know that or the details of it. Especially since you can't control your dreams. Like, that's a weird thing. A great barometer for honesty is to ask yourself this question: am I meeting my own expectations of honesty that I would want my partner to have with me? So am I being as honest with my partner as I expect them to be with me? Perfect honesty in your relationship is unrealistic, to be honest. Dishonesty is human nature. We're all dishonest at times, in small ways, sometimes in big ways, but constantly striving towards honesty is the ideal here. So some questions that you can start asking to explore this principle of honesty is: has your family ever had sexual secrets? How were those sexual secrets handled? Do I want to know my partner for who they are, including their secrets? Or are there things that I don't want to know about because I can't handle them? Like, do I not want to know about their sexual past? Do I not want to know about their fantasies? Because hearing about that stuff would just make me really uncomfortable. Is my partner allowed to have fantasies or experience sexual pleasure or have past sexual experiences that aren't shared with me? Or do I need to know everything? Do I need to know everything about my partner's sexual identity? How much of my partner's sexual past do I need to know about? How have I responded to honesty in the past that might encourage or discourage my partner from sharing with me in the future? Are there things that I've shared with my partner in the past that I shouldn't have, or maybe that I could have shared more effectively so that they could have heard me and not been so reactive? There's so much to explore in this principle of honesty beyond just, are you telling the truth or are you lying? And I hope that as you explore this principle of honesty, you can start to create agreements and start to set expectations with between each other so that you can start having more healthy and productive conversations, and not conversations that just end up in disagreements and fights and people shutting down and getting emotionally volatile and saying things that they're going to regret. The next principle that we're going to talk about is the principle that it breaks my heart that this isn't like the highest one on the list, because it's probably the one that we need to talk about the most, and it's mutual pleasure. Now, if you remember at the beginning of this presentation, I mentioned that sexual health is a balance of safety and pleasure. Well, the first 5 principles of sexual health focus largely on creating the scaffolding for safety. But all too often, especially with couples who are dealing with a porn problem, they've gone through a lot of painful things, the conversation around pleasure is completely absent. They only have conversations about restoring safety. Yet, it's vital to truly knowing your partner and creating a thriving sex life to talk about pleasure. So, when we get curious about pleasure, amazing things start to happen. Here's a couple of questions that you might want to start exploring with it when it comes to pleasure. What are some of your favorite sexual things to do that bring you so much pleasure that you can hardly stand it? What turns you on? Have you ever been surprised by what brought you pleasure? And if so, tell me about that. Like, what was it like for you? What is your relationship with pleasure? Do you embrace it or do you run away from it? What's the first time you remember experiencing sexual pleasure? Was that a good experience? Was it a shameful experience? Did it scare you? Did it like wake you up? Was it amazing? Tell me the story. One of the scary things about talking about pleasure is that it doesn't necessarily follow, that pleasure specifically doesn't necessarily follow the rules of what's socially acceptable or politically correct. Sometimes the things that bring us pleasure are hard to talk about. We don't like to talk about this kind of stuff, but part of the reason that people look at porn, if we're really honest, is because something about that looking at pornography experience is pleasurable. And if you can tolerate the discomfort of the conversation, you might be surprised by what about pornography is pleasurable to your partner. In many cases, it's probably not, it may not even be looking at naked bodies that brings them pleasure. It might be that they're attracted to things that feel forbidden, or it might be that they get excited by the sounds of somebody else making love, or it might be that they like to be told what to do in the bedroom. You know, learning what brings them pleasure when they look at pornography could change the reality and the way that you think and feel about the pornography as it is. When you realize it's not the naked bodies, it's something else, it changes everything. Ultimately, you can't create a healthy sexual relationship with your partner and with yourself without pleasure. It doesn't work. Sexual health doesn't exist without pleasure. I'm going to say it again. Sexual health doesn't exist without pleasure. Just like physical health doesn't exist without a good diet and good nutrition, sexual health doesn't exist without pleasure. It's a necessary ingredient. So it's important to have conversations about it. Otherwise, we can't cultivate more of it. So that wraps up the 6 principles of sexual health. And time again, I've got to tell you, I have seen that as couples start having sexual health conversations and start developing a vision or even a plan for their sexual health as individuals and as a couple, their relationship improves. When they start having conversations about how to cultivate more honesty and how to be safer for each other so that they can be open and honest with each other. When they start having conversations about how they've exploited each other in the past and what impact that's had on their relationship. When they start having conversations about pleasure and what brings them pleasure and how they can experience more pleasure. Like all these areas of their relationship just flourishes. Trust returns. They start to have fun with each other and they start to flirt again. And they become less focused on relapse or slip-ups or betrayal. And they become more focused on creating more connection, more honesty, living their values, not taking advantage of one another, finding ways to explore pleasure together. And they often find that their relationships are more meaningful and connected when they were now, after having these conversations, than they were before the porn was around. So my hope is that you can start to use these conversations as a guide to start developing your own vision for sexual health. And just like physical health, when you stop just trying to avoid sickness and avoid disease and to instead start giving yourself a goal to move towards, when you start having healthy behaviors and values that you can cherish and cultivate in your relationship and start moving towards that stuff instead of just away from the bad stuff, man, it makes a world of difference. And oftentimes the negative behaviors that you want to stop when they're replaced with much more healthy, positive behaviors and an environment of safety and trust. Now, if you ever want to hear what a sexual health conversation sounds like, if you want to hear somebody have a sexual health conversation and just kind of be able, so you can model it in real time, you can join me and Doug Braun-Harvey and a group of other amazing, incredible people, including Kristen Hodson, who's a sex therapist, one of my favorite sex therapists. We do a regular weekly show where we literally have sexual health conversations about the 6 principles of sexual health at rethinkingpornaddiction.com. And I would invite you to come join us there. At the end of the day and at the end of this presentation, my hope is that this gives you something new to focus on. That as you have these conversations, you gain a new perspective around your sexual health, and that your sexual health isn't just dominated by conversations about pornography and betrayal. And as you expand these conversations and start to have these conversations, you can start to unpack, all of the hurt and the disappointment and the craziness and just the drama and the emotion and there's so much that just gets wrapped up around this pornography conversation. And as you have these conversations, that all kind of starts to become untangled, and you start to see your partner for who they are again, and it's really amazing. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and if you have any questions, you're always welcome to reach out to me. My email address is nate@growthmarriage.com, and I hope that this provides a really great framework for you and is kind of like a light at the end of the tunnel.